Something big just broke inside North Korea. It's not a missile failure, not a border leak, not a foreign threat. It's something the regime cannot arrest, censor, or execute. North Korea is running out of people. The birth rate has fallen below replacement. The population is aging. The generation that built the factories, filled the army, and propped up the system is disappearing. And the next one isn't large enough to replace it. For decades, Kim Jong-un's power rested on control. Control of food, control of information, control of fear. But this crisis doesn't respond to control. You can't order more children into existence. You can't imprison demographic math. And once the numbers turn against the regime built on manpower and mobilization, what's coming cannot be stopped. So how did we get here? And why is this the one threat that North Korea, a country that survived famine, sanctions, and total isolation, simply cannot survive? Let's break it down. Now, according to the United Nations Population Fund, North Korea's total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime, stands at roughly 1.77 as of 2025. That's below the replacement level of 2.1, the minimum needed just to keep a population stable from one generation to the next. Now, 1.77 may not sound catastrophic on its own. After all, South Korea's rate was a staggering 0.72 in 2023. That's the lowest on the planet. Japan sits at 1.15. Even Russia's down to 1.4. So why is North Korea's number so dangerous? Well, because context is everything. Japan, they've got robots. Germany has immigration. South Korea has a $1.7 trillion economy and the world's leading tech sector to absorb the blow. But North Korea has none of that. Its economy runs on human muscle. Its farms depend on manual labor. Its factories are decades behind any modern standard. And its military, one of the largest standing armies on the planet, with approximately 1.3 million active duty personnel, depends on a steady supply of young bodies to fill its ranks. But here's what most people miss entirely. That 1.77 number, it's the UN's best guess. And the UN itself admits that it's working with limited and outdated data from a country that barely lets anyone in. The most recent household survey that the UN has access to was conducted by North Korea's own statistics bureau back in 2014. Everything since, well, that's a projection. Independent researchers tell a very different story. A study led by a Bank of Korea economist, based on detailed interviews with thousands of North Korean defectors about their relatives' fertility patterns, found that the real rate had dropped to approximately 1.59 in the early 2000s, and then to 1.38 by the 2010s. A separate research paper presented at an international population conference, drawing on similar defector survey data, produced nearly identical results. Now, if those numbers are closer to the truth, and many experts believe they are, well, then North Korea's demographic decline isn't gradual, it's accelerating, and much further along than the official estimate suggests. The total population sits at roughly 26.6 million. About 68% are of working age, and 13% are already age 65 or older. A staggering share for a country that's this poor, with this little healthcare infrastructure, and this much dependence on physical labor. And there's one more factor that makes North Korea's situation uniquely hopeless. There's no immigration safety valve. Countries like the US or Germany can offset declining births by attracting workers from abroad. But North Korea's political system, its security paranoia, and its total isolation make sustained inward migration virtually impossible. Meanwhile, the people who do leave, defectors, overseas laborers, they're almost always working-age adults. The population doesn't just fail to grow, it actively loses the people that it needs the most. When fertility drops below replacement in a country like this, it doesn't just slow things down. It starts pulling the foundation out from under the entire system. Fewer workers feeding more dependents. Fewer soldiers available for a military that demands them. Fewer state laborers propping up a government that promises everything and increasingly delivers nothing. But these numbers didn't fall overnight. The roots of this crisis stretch decades back, and to one catastrophe that changed everything. North Korea's founding myth is a story of reconstruction. After the Korean War devastated the peninsula, the new socialist state rebuilt with breathtaking speed, fueled by massive aid from the Soviet Union, China, and other socialist allies. Factories went up, mines reopened, the military expanded, and the population boomed, with large post-war families feeding the machine. Now, for a while, the system worked. Heavy industry grew, the state distributed food, housing, and jobs. Citizens were expected to repay that support with labor and loyalty and sacrifice. But by the 1970s and 80s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Growth slowed as the initial burst of Reconstruction faded. North Korea borrowed heavily from Western and Japanese creditors to import industrial machinery, and then defaulted when it couldn't pay its bills. Consumer goods grew scarce. Food shortages worsened year over year. The economic model that once seemed unstoppable was quietly suffocating, long before the political earthquake that would shatter it. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, North Korea lost its most important lifeline overnight. Subsidized fuel, industrial inputs, favorable trade agreements, all gone. The energy grid faltered, factories stalled, and the agricultural system, already fragile and desperately dependent on external inputs, buckled completely. Now, what followed was one of the worst famines of the 20th century. Between roughly 1995 and 2000, an estimated 600,000 to 1 million North Koreans died from starvation and related causes. According to a landmark demographic study published in Population and Development Review, the public distribution system, the state mechanism that controlled food allocation for the entire population, well, that essentially ceased to function. But the famine didn't just kill. It reshaped the way that North Korean families operated permanently. With the state unable to feed its citizens, survival moved into private hands. Informal markets, known as jangmadang, sprang up across the country. What started as desperate roadside trading became a permanent parallel economy. By some estimates, hundreds of jangmadang now operate across North Korea, selling everything from food and clothing to electronics smuggled in from China. And overwhelmingly, it was women who ran them. Men remained tied to state-assigned jobs in factories and mines, often earning wages worth almost nothing in real terms. Women became the breadwinners, trading goods, bartering, traveling between cities, negotiating with border traders, and taking on enormous personal risk just to keep their families alive. And here's where the demographic consequences become devastating. When a household's survival depends on constant trading and informal income, pregnancy doesn't just mean another mouth to feed. It means lost earning time, lost customers, lost momentum in a hyper-competitive market where missing a week can mean losing everything. In that environment, delaying marriage and limiting births, that's not a cultural trend imported from the outside. It's a cold survival calculation made by women who can't afford to stop working. The long-term consequence is a demographic echo that will reverberate for generations. Children not born in the 90s means fewer parents in the 2020s and 2030s. Even if fertility magically stabilized tomorrow, the damage is already locked in. The famine didn't just kill hundreds of thousands of people, it erased the future. A missing generation now colliding with a system that was built for demographic abundance and has no plan for scarcity. And the regime knows it, because in December of 2023, something extraordinary happened. Kim Jong-un stood in front of thousands of women gathered for the 5th National Congress of Mothers in Pyongyang, and he cried. The dictator of the most controlled country on earth, a man who routinely threatens nuclear annihilation, was caught on camera dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief while begging women to have more babies. It was the first time that he had publicly acknowledged the declining birth rate as a national crisis. He called it a matter of housekeeping duties that the nation's mothers had to solve. He urged them to raise their children as communists and pillars of socialist construction. He told them the revolution itself depended on their wombs. The scene was surreal. A nuclear-armed dictator weeping on a stage, reduced to pleading with mothers in a country where dissent can mean a bullet. But tears don't reverse demographic math, and the regime's actual response, well, that hasn't been persuasion, it's been coercion. As far back as 2015, North Korean authorities issued a directive that banned medical professionals from performing abortions and birth control procedures, according to a World Health Organization fact sheet on the country's reproductive policy. The goal was blunt. If women won't choose to have children, the state will remove the choice not to. Since the 2023 Mothers Congress, the mobilization only has escalated. North Korean state media reported in late 2024 that more than 79,000 married women had entered the workforce since the beginning of last year. Women who were previously exempt from compulsory labor, well, they've been deployed to factories, farms, and mines. Not to empower them, but to plug the holes left by a shrinking labor pool. Meanwhile, research based on defector interviews suggests the share of women serving in the military has roughly doubled. from about 5% of women born in the 70s to more than 10% of those born in the 1990s. You can order loyalty, you can demand sacrifice, but you cannot command fertility. And when the regime can't fix the birth rate, the pressure doesn't disappear. It migrates into every system the state depends on to survive. And that's where things get truly dangerous. Let's start with food. North Korea's agricultural system is already running on fumes. The World Health Program has repeatedly documented chronic food insecurity driven by limited arable land, recurring natural disasters, and critical shortages of modern equipment and fertilizer. A joint FAO and WFP assessment described how fuel and electricity shortages disrupt everything from planting schedules to crop transport and storage, making the entire food chain more dependent on human labor at the exact moment that that labor is disappearing. The rural workforce is aging rapidly. Younger workers are being siphoned toward military or urban mobilization campaigns. Fewer hands in the fields, that doesn't mean just lower yields. It means deeper dependence on outside aid, illicit trade, or imports that the country can barely afford. And less food doesn't just cause hunger, it reinforces the very spiral driving the crisis. Malnutrition and uncertainty deter family formation. Fewer births mean fewer future workers. The cycle tightens with every passing year, and there's no policy lever powerful enough to break it. And then you've got the military, the institution that will consume more of North Korea's identity and resources than almost anything else. With roughly 1.3 million active duty personnel drawn from a population of just 26.6 million, North Korea maintains one of the highest military to civilian ratios on the planet. Every man between the ages of 17 and 30 is expected to serve, often for a decade or more. But with every passing year, the pool of eligible recruits, it shrinks. The regime has already responded by lowering physical eligibility standards, shifting from voluntary enlistment to de facto conscription, and drafting far more women. In the fall of 2024, North Korea sent an estimated 10,000 troops to fight alongside Russian forces in a war against Ukraine, a deployment that raised global alarm, but also quietly exposed something that the regime would rather keep hidden. A country struggling to fill its own farms and factories was exporting soldiers to a foreign battlefield. Reports from South Korean and Ukrainian intelligence indicated that these troops included Special Operations Forces, some of North Korea's best trained, most physically capable young men. Well, they were sent to die in a war that had nothing to do with the Korean Peninsula. So why would a labor-starved state send its most valuable manpower abroad? Well, because the calculus isn't demographic, it's transactional. Pyongyang reportedly gained military technology, economic support, and political cover from Moscow in return. But the demographic cost is real, even if Kim Jong-un didn't want to count it. Every casualty in Kursk is one more young man who will never come to work in a field, staff a factory, or father a child. Now, these are not signs of strength, but symptoms of a system that's rationing its most critical resource, people. And every soldier pulled from the civilian economy is one less worker in a field, a factory, or a mine. The competition between military needs and economic survival grows fiercer with every birth that doesn't happen. And then there are the promises that the regime made to its own citizens, promises that it can no longer keep. North Korea's constitution guarantees universal free medical care, state-run childcare, material support for the elderly, and special protection for mothers. Beautiful words on paper, but with 13% of the population already over 65, and that share climbing steadily, the costs of those promises rises every year, while the workforce available to fund them contracts. Households absorb what the state cannot, and the people doing most of that absorbing, well, those are women. The same women that the regime needs in factories, in fields, and producing the next generation that still isn't coming. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. The most dangerous consequence of demographic decline, that's not about farms, factories, or even the military, but about control itself. North Korea's entire power structure depends on a monopoly over food, over employment, over information, over daily life. For decades, the state was the only provider. If you wanted to eat, you went through the system. If you wanted to work, you went where the state sent you. And if you wanted to survive, you obeyed. The famine broke that monopoly. When the public distribution system collapsed, millions of North Koreans built their own survival networks outside state channels. The Yangmandang markets don't just feed people, They created an alternative economy that the state doesn't fully command. Women became the backbone of this shadow system. Households stopped depending on the regime and started depending on themselves. And once people taste that kind of autonomy, even the desperate, exhausting kind, well, they don't easily give it back. Demographic decline accelerates this erosion. If the state cannot provide a future worth reproducing, meaning stable food, functioning healthcare, housing, a reason to believe tomorrow will be better than today, well, people will continue to limit births regardless of what the propaganda demands. If coercive measures reach further into reproductive life, resentment will deepen, trust will erode, and the social contract that has held this regime together since its founding, well, that thins a little more with every generation that chooses not to create the next one. The regime's instinct, historically, is not reform, it's repression, tighter surveillance, harsher punishment for unauthorized economic activity, stricter border enforcement. But repression can only manage symptoms. It cannot create prosperity, and it cannot create children. And for those who can't take it anymore, there's one final option, and even that is being strangled. In 2025, just 224 North Koreans made it to South Korea, according to the Ministry of Unification. That's down from 236 the year before, and a fraction of more than the 1,000 who escaped annually before the COVID-19 pandemic sealed the borders. The North Korea-China border remains effectively shut. Beijing has deployed advanced surveillance technology across key transit provinces to detect and intercept undocumented North Koreans. Escape routes through Southeast Asia have narrowed to almost nothing. China's policy of forcibly repatriating defectors back to North Korea, where they face imprisonment, torture, or worse, has further choked the flow. But the numbers, small as they are, still matter. The overwhelming majority of those who leave are working-age adults, many of them women. Every defector represents one less worker in a labor-starved economy, one less soldier in a military that can't afford to shrink, one less potential parent in a country desperately short of births. Since 1998, more than 34,500 North Koreans have resettled in the South. The demographic cost of defection isn't measured in individual departures. It's measured in what those people represent. The exact human capital a declining society can least afford to lose. So what does all of this add up to? Not an explosion, not a revolution, but something slower, quieter, and far harder to stop. North Korea was built as a project of mass mobilization, a state that demands sacrifice and promised collective security in return. For decades, that deal held, sustained by large post-war generations and by systems of control that depended on a predictable and obedient and replaceable workforce. But the country's modern history has steadily undercut that foundation. Economic stagnation choked growth before the Cold War even ended. The famine killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped family life forever. Marketization shifted survival into households and informal networks. And now, fertility has fallen below replacement, and the state confronts aging without the wealth, technology, or openness that makes such transitions survivable anywhere else on Earth. This is the quiet mechanism that can weaken even the most tightly controlled regimes on the planet. Not a single uprising, but the slow disappearance of the future. As the working-age population narrows, every sector competes for shrinking labor. As the elderly share grows, resources and care needs expand beyond what the system was ever designed to handle. As families lose confidence that a child will inherit anything worth inheriting, births decline further, and the state tightens control in response. But repression cannot substitute demographic renewal. You can seal the border, you can ban contraception, you can even weep on national television, but none of it will change the math. Other countries have faced this challenge and adapted. Painfully, maybe imperfectly, but they adapted. They opened their economies, they welcomed immigrants, they invested in technology. They gave women genuine choices and genuine support. North Korea has done none of these things, and the window for doing them narrows with every year the birth rate stays below replacement. Missiles can extend deterrence, but they cannot extend demographics. North Korea has survived sanctions, it survived famine, it survived total isolation from the modern world. But something fundamental just broke. The future stopped replacing itself. And once a nation begins consuming its own demographic foundation, collapse doesn't just come as an invasion. It comes as disappearance. And Kim Jong-un cannot stop what's coming. So what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for the most isolated regime on Earth? Or will the Kim dynasty find yet another way to outlast the odds? Let us know in the comments, and if you're following how history actually moves, slowly, structurally, and often invisibly, hit subscribe. Fall of Nations doesn't just cover the headlines, we cover what's underneath them.